Hello, everyone. Welcome to the online version of our course here at St. Joseph University in spring of 2020. Wow. Anyway, before we got into the third reading from the Phaedo, I thought that since there's such a gap between the last time we met and are picking up the thread of the thing this week, that I would do a little recap of what's happened in the Phaedo previous to reading 3, and maybe just some overall remarks as you read it. You get a sense, reacquaint yourself with what this dialogue is actually about. Of course, it's about the immortality of the soul, and it's about a lot more than that. But primarily because of the nature of our class, that's what we're really concerned with. Is the central question is whether the soul is immortal, whether death is the absolute end of the person. You can think of Plato, I think, and the Phaedo in particular, as a response to Epicurus, as a denial of Epicurus. Remember that Epicurus had a theory of death that was pretty much adequately described in about 4 sentences. And that was that death is the privation of all awareness. So it was something that could be neither good nor bad for the human being. And in fact, it was nothing to the human being, because it was not something that we would ever experience. That when we are, death has not come. And when death has come, we are not. So there's no overlap between us and death. It's not something that he thought was necessarily worth speaking about too much. And the idea that it was the privation of all awareness, of course, implied that it was the permanent and irrevocable privation of all awareness. That as I said in class, that he was an annihilationist, that he believed that we become nothing at death, that death is the termination of all possible life and experience. Plato is trying to refute that. There's no question about it. I mean, in the sense that he's trying to conceptualize an entirely different notion of what death is. And I can't say more strongly that Plato's starting point, Socrates' starting point in the dialogue, is on page 9. Where he says at the top of that page, "Do we believe death to be anything?" "We do," replied Simmias. "And do we not believe it to be the separation of the soul from the body?" Does not death mean that the body comes? Well, let's just leave it at that. That death is the separation of the soul from the body. A different way of conceiving of death than Epicurus. And you might say this is Plato's starting point. Now he immediately goes on, as we've noted in class, to say, does not death mean that the body comes to exist by itself, separated from the soul, and that the soul exists by herself, separated from the body? What is death but that? It is that, he said. Well, there are things to begin to be more questionable, because the whole point of the dialogue, I think, philosophically speaking, in terms of what it's actually trying to prove, is that after that separation of the soul from the body, that the soul continues its existence, that it can exist separate from the body, that soul can be independent of body. Of course, Socrates has this theory that the philosopher welcomes death because the soul freed from the body can now gain true knowledge, because it's able to commune with truth in a way that it wasn't before. That is a very beautiful theory, I think, but of course it gets challenged by the two most active, for the only two interlocutors here, the people that Socrates is speaking with, Simmias and Cebes. Their first challenge is on page 15, towards the bottom. When Socrates had finished, Cebes replied to him and said, I think that for the most part you are right, Socrates, but men are very incredulous of what you have said of the soul. They fear that she will no longer exist anywhere when she has left the body, but that she will be destroyed and perish on the very day of death. They think that the moment that she is released and leaves the body, she will be dissolved and vanish away like breath or smoke, and thenceforward cease to exist at all. If she were to exist somewhere as a whole, released from the evils which you enumerated just now, we should have good reason to hope, Socrates, that what you say is true. But it will need no little persuasion and assurance to show that the soul exists after death and continues to possess any power or wisdom. Which is to say, I mean, the Siebes is really doing what I did in that first definition of death. Siebes is saying, okay, let's define death as the separation of soul and body. That's fine. But what you need to establish is that the soul, after it separates from the body, continues to have an existence without body. And that is a tough thing to try to prove. But that's exactly what Socrates goes on to try to do. Immediately in the argument from opposites, which we looked at, and then the argument from knowledge is recollection, the idea that if human beings don't really learn anything new, but just remember what they already know, what they intrinsically know, then the soul must have existed before our birth, so that we gained that knowledge at that time. It's a continuing idea in Plato's dialogues. It's much more, in other areas, it's more clearly explained than here, but that's the idea. And also this introduces the idea of the forms, which sets up the last, in this section, the last argument for the immortality of the soul, and that's what's known in the secondary literature as the argument from affinity. That is, Plato's idealism, Socrates' idealism, is founded on the idea that concepts, ideas, what he calls the forms, most of all, are what's truly real, and that, as I said in class, that we have that these ideas, these intellectual things, which have no physical aspect, we don't know them through the senses, we know them purely through the intellect or through the soul, I guess, if intellect is part of soul, that these things are eternal truths, the idea of the absolutes, the in themselves. And one of the things that I may have said in class is that concepts like, say, mathematical concepts, mathematical ideas are things that maybe never change because they're not physical, because they're not in time. The argument from affinity is that since we know these things through the soul must be enough like these things in order to know them. So just as the eternal forms, the ideas are eternal and unchanging, so must the soul be eternal and, I suppose, unchanging. That's the argument from affinity, which is actually a pretty interesting argument. And if you look at maybe some of the videos that I have from a previous class below, it's explained in more detail. That's kind of where we are when we get to the reading here. Socrates has given us some reasons to believe that the soul is immortal, but hasn't really convinced in the fullest sense these two characters, Simmias and Siebes. And when Socrates sees that they are still skeptical, that he has really proved that the soul is immortal, he encourages them to articulate their doubts, He says you shouldn't hesitate just because of the circumstances here. I know that I'll die today, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to talk seriously about death. And that's pretty much where we are when we pick up in the third reading.